The Black Death, Flea bites, and cargo manifests. You are standing, in your imagination, on the wooden quay at the port of Kaffa on the Crimean coast in the autumn of 1346. It is unremarkable at first glance: bundled wool bales, tar-smelling ropes, the occasional shouted bargain between a Genos factor and a Tatar grain merchant. Yet everything here is tinged with a faint unease and almost imperceptible shortening of tempers, a lingering cough that merchants no longer even attempt to hide. You might miss it if you focus only on the grandeur of the fortress walls or the bright paint on the Venetian crates. The story of plague always begins like this. There is nothing obviously dramatic until, all at once, everything is. The Mongol siege that summer has left corpses scattered outside the walls, and rumor has it the attackers have begun flinging some of them over the parapets with catapults. The Genos sailors mutter about a curse, but the ship captains are more practical. Every new body catapulted into the city is potential rotten timber in their profit calculations. Still, the Manifesti de Carico must be filled, and ships must sail before the winter winds close the Black Sea. So the decks of a modest galley named Santa Clara, her name carefully lettered, her planks reeking of pitch, are hurriedly loaded with silks, alum, and sacks of suspiciously chittering grain. You watch the cargo superintendent scratch each crate onto his wax tablet. Every notch matters. Each tally will be checked again in Pura or Messina. A handful of fleas, hidden in the fur of a brown rat that slips unnoticed down a mooring line, matter far more. But the clerk does not know this. He drones the inventory in a tone so flat it could lull a wakeful child to sleep. 20 sacks of rye flour, 3 barrels of salted fish, 1 chest of saffron, 2 of linen thread. These are the boring bones of maritime commerce, but they are the very ligaments by which plague will travel. Below deck, the ship's cat rubs against coils of rope, scattering fleas like fine black pepper. The sailors, hardened men who can read the stars yet barely write their own names, are suspicious only of storms and pirates. They have no vocabulary for bacteria. They do notice, however, that Giacomo the cook has been slow to rise. He says his groin aches. They shrug it as likely just a cramped hammock or an old wound, reopened by damp air. No one counts the restless turns he makes in the night, or the sweat soaking his thin blanket. When the Santa Clara finally drops her sails and slides westward, she joins a small convoy. One carrack carries beeswax, another, bulk grain for the hungry ports of the Levant. You picture the ships becalmed at sunrise, gulls circling overhead, the sea a polished mirror. Somewhere in the dark hold, Giacomo's fever climbs. By the third day, he is delirious, clutching at the edges of consciousness and muttering the Ave Maria. The captain orders extra watered wine for the crew to keep spirits up, but privately instructs the first mate to pitch Giacomo's bedding overboard. He does so at dusk, where no one sees the fat flea that leaps from the blanket to the boot of an assistant, and then into a crack between deck planks. Here, you pause to consider a flea's life. Xenopsilla chiapus is not a glamorous creature. It is wingless, dull brown, and no bigger than a speck of dust. Yet its gut is the stage on which Yersinia pestis clogs up, forcing the flea to regurgitate infected blood back into each new bite. The flea does not know why it feels hungry even as it feeds, just as sailors do not know why theirs is a hot, swelling sickness rather than a simple fever. All of them, man, flea, bacterium, are following instincts older than history. By the time Santa Clara reaches Constantinople's outer roads for a brief provisioning stop, Giacomo has been dropped over the rail, sewn in his hammock, with only a single stone for ballast. His shipmates murmur a short prayer. The weight of death is already too familiar to linger over one cook. The assistant who helped carry the corpse remarks that his armpit has a knot like a pigeon's egg. He rubs at it irritably and goes back to coiling lines. Constantinople itself is no stranger to plague. A devastating outbreak 6 centuries earlier is still remembered in church chronicles. Yet memory is no immune system. The city's wharfs are as busy as ever, with spices, manuscripts, and crates of wax candles for distant cathedrals changing hands by the hour. A stevedore in ragged wool hefts a barrel aboard Santa Clara and pauses to wipe his brow. A single flea hops from rat to stevedore to sailor, and then back to the cat's fur. The exchange takes less than a blink. You may be wondering why no one, at any point, simply burns a suspicious sack of grain or quarantines the crew. The concept of lazaretti isolation. Hospitals for plague victims does exist by the mid-14th century, but it is enforced unevenly. Italian port cities will later refine systems of health passes and cordons, but in this exact slice of time, such measures are improvisational at best. Profit margins are thin. Political rivalries are thick. A captain who hesitates risks losing cargo contracts to a competitor. Thus the Santa Clara presses on, skimming along the Aegean, making for Messina and Sicily the usual first European port of call. Along the deck rails, sailors sometimes lean out at dawn, watching cormorants dive. You imagine them sharing stale jokes, flicking walnut shells into the foam, spitting over the side to see whose saliva floats farthest. It is all numbing routine until the assistant collapses. While tugging at a halyard, his armpit bubo has doubled in size and is mottled black. The ship's surgeon, such as he is, slices it open with a fish gutter's knife, expecting pus to drain. What emerges is thin, blood-tinged fluid, and nothing more. The patient's breath rasps like a saw. Cutting wetwood. That evening, as the lookout marks a faint smudge of land on the horizon, another sailor complains of headache and chills. Even the superstitious among them, men who swear by iron nails hammered into mastheads to ward off witches, begin to sense a pattern. The captain enters a terse note in his log. If more fall ill, will put in at Messina and seek help. He cannot know that Messina will be the first spark that sets half of Europe alight. Messina's harbor on the 1st of October 1347 is bustling but tense. Granaries stand half empty after a poor harvest. Rumors of northern unrest reach the quays. Amid this background, Santa Clara anchors and strikes her sails. The harbor master rows out, notes the limp bodies on deck, and hesitates. Some accounts say he tried to refuse entry. Others claim bribes exchanged hands. Whatever the truth, the hawsers are eventually made fast to the stone quay, and cargo starts to roll ashore. Picture the first messenger who ferries a letter from the Genos quarter to the cathedral square. He stops for a mug of watered wine, scratches a flea bite on his ankle, and continues on. He is a minor thread, but the tapestry of contagion is woven of such threads. Within a week, the cathedral bells toll with unnatural frequency. Within a month, so many priests are dead that burials occur without last rites. You see, in the end, how mundane decisions the tally of a clerk, the sting of a flea, the reluctance of a captain to lose a day's profit converge into catastrophe. Yet from the quay at Caffa to the harbor at Messina, no single moment feels like the thunderclap of doom that later chronicles suggest. Plague creeps, almost politely, through cracks in the ordinary. And now, as lamps are snuffed aboard the Santa Clara and the air in Messina grows thick with the scent of early autumn figs, one small question hovers unanswered. What ran through the mind of a simple carpenter in York, hundreds of miles away, when he first noticed that the price of candles had mysteriously doubled? The carpenter in York, that quiet figure who noticed the odd spike in candle prices, might not have thought much of it at first. Prices rose and fell often. War, bad weather, poor harvests, any number of things could cause goods to vanish or merchants to grow greedy. But when his neighbor, a weaver's apprentice, failed to open his stall for 3 days in a row, and when a priest arrived wearing not just his stole, but a soaked cloth tied around his mouth, the carpenter started to understand something more than inflation was at work. By November of 1347, reports of a strange, swelling illness had reached the southern coast of England through scattered merchants and letters. London was still unaware, or perhaps simply unwilling to listen. After all, plagues were a thing of biblical wrath or old Eastern legends, not something that climbed aboard spice ships and nestled in alehouses. But in Messina, where the Santa Clara had docked weeks earlier, there was no room for disbelief. You imagine the daily life in that port city before the plague, a town full of shouting fishmongers, ink-stained scribes, linen traders, and cobblers. At the monastery of San Placido, the Benedictine monks tended their gardens, recited the divine office, and copied worn manuscripts by candlelight. They had seen disease before. They had buried children of famine and soothed the sores of syphilitic. Pilgrims, but never had they buried so many in so little time. At first, they tried to bury the dead in the usual way: a wooden coffin, a cloth shroud, a blessing, a name spoken aloud. Then, as death outpaced the gravediggers, they resorted to shared pitsfas, commune lined with lime and sealed hurriedly. The monks still prayed over them, but the prayers grew shorter. Then, one by one, the monks themselves began to fall ill. There's something haunting about the inventory records from these abbés. Scrawled Latin entries record not just names, but numbers. Died. Brother Matteo died. Brother Lucius died. Brother Tommaso. The ink gets darker, thicker, shakier. One entry reads simply, "Too many to list. Lord preserve us. Messina's noble families fled to the countryside." But even that escape brought little relief. The plague moved inland, along trade routes, like an invisible wind. Carts once filled with wool and olives now carried the sick. The priests and monks, who had once tended to lepers and beggars, were overwhelmed. Many tried to maintain normalcy, ringing bells for matins, trimming candle wicks, warming thin broth, but soon they, too, were lying silent beneath the floorboards of their own sanctuaries. Now imagine the journey northward, not in the dramatic sense of conquest or pilgrimage, but as a slow, unstoppable seepage. In Genoa, the docks filled with anxious murmurs. Venice enforced harsh maritime quarantines. Trentino, or 30-day isolation for suspicious ships, which would soon become the quarantino we now know as quarantine. But even that wasn't enough. A single infected rat slipping ashore, a merchant's child scratching at a flea bite, this was all it took. By early 1348, the plague had reached Marseille and then Avignon, where Pope Clement VI resided. There, a firestorm of death consumed the streets. The Pope ordered that massive fires be lit around the papal palace, believing the smoke would cleanse the air. Physicians, still operating under the theory of miasma, bad air burned juniper, pine, and rosemary. They also advised bloodletting, crushed emeralds, and in one case, powdered unicorn horn. All of it failed. Yet even amidst panic, life carried on. Bakers still baked. Bells still rang. In Bruges, artists still painted miniature manuscripts, though their lines trembled more than before. In Paris, the university debated whether the plague was due to a recent planetary conjunction or divine punishment. Some scholars wrote letters blaming the Jewish communities, an accusation that would soon spark horrific pogroms. That, too, is a grim aspect of this history. The terror of the unknown turned neighbors against neighbors. Entire Jewish quarters were burned or expelled under suspicion of poisoning wells. One chronicle from Strasbourg records that 2,000 Jews were massacred in a single day. It is a sickening footnote, yet all too real. In the face of death, superstition often eclipsed reason and compassion. Meanwhile, in rural England, the winter of 1348 brought rumors carried by traveling friars. A pestilence, they said, was coming, born not from the devil, but from the east. A merchant from London had brought home silks and spices, but also a strange fever. The carpenter in York might have heard these stories over an ale-soaked table. Maybe he laughed. Maybe he went to church. More often, maybe he sharpened his tools and tried not to think about it. But then, spring arrived, and with it, the ships in ports like Bristol and Southampton. The first confirmed outbreaks in England began in earnest. The symptoms were the same: fever, weakness, vomiting, and large swellings, buboes around the groin, neck, or armpits. Within days, some turned black in the face and extremities, a sign of internal bleeding. The death rate was staggering. In some parishes, as many as 2/3 of the population died. And yet, amid all this, markets still opened. Fishermen still cast nets. Grain still had to be milled. People still married, prayed, and even laughed dark, bitter laughter, but laughter nonetheless. This is one of the most curious truths about the Black Death, that it did not utterly halt life, but distorted it into strange, almost surreal shapes. You might imagine a monk in an English abbey, writing the names of the dead in his ledger by candlelight, the nib of his quill dragging with fatigue. He dips it in ink again and again, recording each name with a kind of weary devotion. Then, just as the candle gutters, he writes his own. And what of the ordinary people? The women who nursed their children, only to bury them a day later? The men who dug graves for strangers, because no one was left to claim the bodies in some towns? Priests no longer even performed last rites. The dead were left in homes or on porches, wrapped in sheets. Dogs and crows grew fat. Bells tolled until no one had the strength to ring them. Even kings were not spared. King Alfonso XI of Castile died in March 1350, in the midst of battle preparations. He simply collapsed. His death made clear that status offered no immunity. Pope Clement VI, though he survived, reportedly consecrated the entire Rhone River, so that the bodies tossed into it would receive a form of baptism. So many died in Avignon that the cemeteries overflowed and corpses were stacked like logs still. Even as death mounted, efforts were made to document, understand, and respond. Physicians recorded symptoms and attempted cures. Chroniclers like Jean de Venette and Giovanni Boccaccio described the collapse of social order. Boccaccio's Decameron, written as a kind of escape narrative, tells of young nobles retreating to a villa outside Florence, passing the time with stories while the world around them dies. It is escapism, yes, but also a window into how people endured. Let us return now to England, where the carpenter in York, once skeptical, finds his neighbor's house boarded up. The mayor of the town has issued a decree: no funerals, no gatherings, no markets without a license. The church bells ring far too often now. The carpenter watches as a cart rolls past his window, loaded not with timber, but with bodies. And yet he still wakes early, still tends his fire, still carves joints, and pegs with careful hands. Perhaps it is habit, perhaps it is faith, or perhaps, like so many others, he simply does not know what else to do. Even in plague, daily life continues. Markets thin but do not vanish, monasteries crumble, but a few still chant the hours, and graves massive, unmarked, lime-filled pits grow deeper and deeper, each spadeful of earth bearing witness to an age that could not yet comprehend the word bacteria. As the carpenter tightens the strap on his satchel and prepares to walk to the churchyard for morning prayers, the sky over York remains gray, unchanged, indifferent. The plague has not yet reached its peak. The dead are not yet done. And so you might wonder, what happened when all the priests were gone, and the sick still needed someone to whisper prayers in their final moments? The year is now 1349, and the plague has reached the marrow of Europe. In England, spring has not brought renewal, it has brought silence. The carpenter in York, whose life we've followed in quiet glimpses, now walks past homes with windows shuttered, not from the cold but from fear. The market square where children once ran barefoot is almost still. A parchment is nailed to the church door, by order of His Grace the Bishop. All religious gatherings are hereby suspended until further notice. But people are still dying, and dying people still want prayers. So what happens when the priests are gone? In some places, monks and friars continued their duties until the very end. A few took the sacraments to the sick even after others had fled. Yet in other towns, with clergy dead or vanished, ordinary people, women, laborers, widows began to whisper prayers over their neighbors. Makeshift crosses were erected not by deacons, but by stonemasons. The last rites were reduced to whatever words could be remembered and spoken between sobs. In this strange twilight of normalcy, death was at once everywhere and numbly familiar. Grave diggers were now the busiest men in town. Some became callous, drinking heavily and demanding coin before digging. Others, like one chronicler's account from Norwich tells us, quietly folded the hands of each corpse and tucked a sprig of rosemary beneath the chin, but the scale of the plague defied even the most devoted. In London, the churchyards filled so quickly that bodies were buried in layers like loam. Clerks tried to keep records, but eventually they just stopped writing names. And yet, amid this slow-motion catastrophe, people adapted. In France, doctors began to wear the now famous plague Dr. Masca-beaked contraption stuffed with herbs. It looked ridiculous and terrifying, but it was based on a sincere belief that sweet-smelling substances could protect against miasma or bad air. These physicians moved from house to house, poking at the sick with long sticks, rarely speaking. They were less healers and more catalogers of decay. In the countryside, villagers placed candles in their windows and chalk crosses on doors. Fields were left unharvested, vineyards went untended. The wine still fermented in its barrels, but no one came to drink it. In cities, entire streets were burned in an attempt to purify them. Sometimes they succeeded only in spreading smoke and fear. Still, daily tasks lingered in stubborn corners. Midwives delivered babies even as others buried the dead. Bakers, litvans, a few teachers taught what children still remained. And in households that hadn't yet been touched by the plague, families quietly hoped, cleaned obsessively, and hung branches of bay leaves at their doors. This is what resilience looked like. Not grand, not heroic, but small and exhausted and tender. Then came the next phase, not of sickness, but of absence. When the wave of plague finally began to ebb in the early 1350s, Europe looked around and scarcely recognized itself. Entire villages had vanished. In parts of France and Italy, so many farmers had died that grain rotted in the fields. In England, labor shortages were so severe that wages rose dramatically. Landowners were furious. The government passed the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349, trying to force people to work for pre-plague wages, but bargaining power had shifted. Serfs began to leave their lords. A peasant who once had no rights now had something rare: choice. You may not think of the Black Death as an economic turning point, but it was. The rigid feudal structure cracked. Towns began to swell with landless workers. In Florence, survivors bought up abandoned homes for cheap and suddenly became landlords. In the German states, artisans banded together in guilds to protect their trades. Everywhere, society had to reassemble itself from scattered pieces. There were cultural echoes, too. You've likely seen images of the dance macabre, skeletal figures leading the living in a somber dance of death. These became common in frescoes and stained glass. They weren't meant to terrify, but to remind death comes for all, even kings, even popes. In literature, voices grew more cynical and darkly humorous. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the decades after the plague, is full of bawdy jokes and biting satire. It's as if people had seen too much death to take pretensions seriously anymore. Morality plays became more somber. Art tilted toward the symbolic, the introspective, the haunted, and spiritually for some. The plague deepened faith. They saw it as a divine punishment and responded with renewed devotion. The flagellants, roving bands of penitents, whipped themselves in public, crying for forgiveness. But for others, faith cracked. Priests had died or fled. Prayers had gone unanswered. The idea that God was watching no longer brought comfort. It brought suspicion. Was he watching? And if so, why? Had he let so many suffer? The carpenter in York might not have pondered theology, but he felt the shift. When the bells rang again, fewer now, and slower, he resumed his walk to the church. It was quieter. Half the pews were empty. The incense seemed thicker, and the priest, younger than he remembered, paused longer at each line of the Mass. Outside the church, a graveyard had expanded into what used to be a sheep pasture. There were no markers, just churned earth and one thin wooden cross leaning slightly in the wind. He glanced at it, adjusted the strap of his satchel, and continued down the lane to buy nails. This is what survival looked like. Leprosy, linen bandages, and the quiet road to exile. You find yourself in a small medieval town. Not the kind that appears in tourist brochures or cathedral chronicles, but a modest settlement tucked beside a slow-moving river with timber framed houses and streets paved not with stone, but with packed earth. Chickens wander freely. Laundry hangs from upper windows. At first glance, it is a peaceful, forgettable place, but near its edge, where the road turns to fields, there is a gate. Beyond the gate, a small chapel, and beside that chapel, a cluster of wooden huts surrounded by wild rosemary and silence. This is a leprosarium. And if you lived here, you would no longer be allowed to live anywhere else. Leprosy, what we now know as Hansen's disease, was one of the most feared conditions in the medieval world. Not necessarily for the agony it caused, though it did, but for what it meant: social death before physical death. A diagnosis meant exile. It meant ritual separation. It meant walking a road not just of illness, but of absence. In the 12th century, medical knowledge was scarce and often tangled with theology. The cause of leprosy was debated in universities, monasteries, and town councils. Some blamed sin. Others invoked miasma. A few physicians tried to tie it to poor diet or bad blood. But regardless of the theory, the outcome was the same. Once the signs appeared: patchy numbness, pale lesions, foot ulcers, a loss of eyebrows, there would be a trial. Yes, a trial. Imagine standing before your local bishop or a city health officer. You would be examined, touched with gloves, asked to describe your symptoms, and if your condition matched the telltale signs: leprous hands that could not feel heat, feet that dragged, breath that reeked of rot, you would be declared unclean. The community would pray for your soul, and then they would escort you away, not all at once. The ritual was oddly gentle, heartbreakingly so. You would be taken to the church. A priest would give you last rites, not because you were dying, but because you were about to be dead to the world. You might lie in a grave as a symbol of your separation. You would be handed a cloak, a wooden bowl, a bell to ring if you passed near others. Then you would be walked, sometimes by family, often by clergy, to the leprosarium outside the town walls. There you would begin your new life, not entirely alone. These places, often run by monastic orders, were humble but not cruel. The huts were simple, the meals were spare, but you had a bed, you had broth, you had prayer. What you did not have anymore was touch, because leprosy, while not nearly as contagious as people feared, was misunderstood. Most people did not know it spread slowly. Through long-term contact, they believed it clung to breath, to clothing, to utensils. You might be forbidden to wash in public wells. You could not attend Mass in the main church. You could not trade in the market. And yet, you could still see the world you once belonged to from the top of a hill, or behind the chapel wall. You might glimpse your old town, smoke from a hearth, the sound of a market bell, a child's laughter carried on the wind. The pain of leprosy was not just physical. It was the ache of watching life go on without you. Let's turn now to the daily life inside the leprosarium. You might rise early, light a small fire if you could, recite the morning prayers. Meals came at regular times, usually gruel, sometimes fish. On feast days, maybe a bit of cheese. A monk or lay brother might read scripture aloud. You would wrap your sores in linen soaked in wine or vinegar. The bandages were changed once a day. You learned to do it yourself if you could. There were no mirrors. You did not need them. You could see the changes in each other. Faces swelling and flattening, fingers shortening, noses dissolving into soft collapse. But there was a grace in this, to an unspoken tenderness. You did not stare. You did not flinch. You looked one another in the eye, and that was enough. Sometimes children lived here too, born to mothers already infected, or sent away from home after showing the earliest signs. They played in the chapel yard, chasing chickens or singing songs learned before they were banished. Their laughter was not mournful. It was simply smaller, quieter, without an audience. The monks who cared for these communities were often compassionate, even brave. Many of them contracted the disease over time. They believed service to the sick was service to Christ himself. One order, the Order of St. Lazarus, was even founded specifically to support lepers. In some towns, lay people donated bread or wool in exchange for prayers from the leprosarium. In that way, the lepers remained part of the spiritual life of the town. Even as their bodies were pushed away, there were rules, of course. You had to stay within certain boundaries. You had to ring your bell if traveling near populated areas. Some lepers were granted special robes with a distinctive cross or hood. These were not marks of punishment, but of legal status, a way to prevent arrest or abuse. While moving through the world. And yet, not all towns were kind. In parts of France and Spain, lepers were accused of poisoning wells or spreading disease. Through sorcery, pogroms erupted. Some leprosaria were burned down with their residents still inside. These acts, thankfully, were not universal, but they happened. For many lepers, the years passed slowly. Some died of the disease. Others simply grew old, their bodies worn by infection and time. There were no dramatic endings. No cures, just days that bled into one another, one bowl of broth, one prayer, one tightening of a bandage at a time. But there were moments of joy, too. A sunny afternoon in spring, a story told by a visiting friar, a loaf of fresh bread left anonymously at the chapel door. Even exile has its kindnesses. By the late 13th century, leprosy had spread widely enough that most towns had at least one leprosarium. Royal decrees sometimes funded them. Nobles occasionally endowed chapels in return for prayers. In a strange way, the leper, once the most feared and rejected, had become a symbol of spiritual purity, of suffering borne with patience. You might ask, how could a society that feared lepers so much also hold them up as holy? Because medieval life was full of contradiction. Suffering was seen as both punishment and blessing. To endure pain without complaint was to imitate Christ, and lepers, those who lived without comfort, without touch, without hope, were seen by some as closer to God than the rest of us. Still, not all saw it that way. The carpenter in York, yes. He still lives. Once passed by the gate of a leper house on the edge of town. He quickened his step, not from hatred, but from fear. He'd heard the rumors that it could live on cloth, on the air, even in one's shadow. He muttered a short prayer and crossed himself. He never looked back. And within that leprosarium, a woman named Cecily, once a baker's wife, watched him pass from the wooden bench where she now spent her mornings. She didn't know his name, but she remembered the smell of sawdust and the way some men walked quickly, with eyes lowered, as if fleeing a memory. She tucked her hands deeper into her sleeves and began again, softly, to hum. Let's return to Cecily, the woman on the wooden bench, humming to herself behind the leprosarium walls. Once upon a time, she was known in town for her bread, not because it was the softest or the cheapest, but because she carved a tiny crescent moon on each loaf. No one remembers now why she started doing that. Maybe it reminded her of a lullaby. Maybe it was a mark to tell her work apart from the other women's in the market. It doesn't matter. The point is that people once said her name with affection. Now, they barely say it at all. Cecily, like so many others marked by leprosy, exists in the pause between memory and forgetting. She is alive, yes, but socially erased. It's a strange space to occupy. You are not entirely gone, but you are also no longer fully present in the world you came from. You might think such erasure was cruel, and in many ways, it was. But for medieval society, it was also ritualized, codified, and oddly compassionate in its own language. Leprosy was seen not only as a danger to the body, but as a distortion of divine order. And so the process of exclusion was wrapped in ceremony, scripture, and sometimes dignity. In the 13th century Ritual Romanum, the church prescribed a formal funeral for lepers, a mass, a procession, a sprinkling of holy water over the afflicted. After this rite, they were considered dead to the world, but the ritual also promised them spiritual elevation. Their suffering was likened to that of Job, their sores to Christ's wounds. The idea was simple. Though the body failed, the soul could still ascend. This concept gave birth to a peculiar reverence for lepers. In certain corners of medieval piety, they were feared, yes, but also pitied, and sometimes even honored. Stories circulated of lepers whose patience, kindness, or wisdom made them almost saintly. Take, for instance, Saint Lazarus, patron saint of lepers and the poor. His image was everywhere, in leper chapels, on coins, embroidered on hospital flags. The Order of Saint Lazarus, established during the Crusades, tended to lepers in both the Holy Land and across Europe. In some cities, their hospitals were granted generous endowments by royalty. You might be surprised to learn that some lepers themselves formed communities that were not just places of refuge but of purpose. There are records of lepers tending gardens, brewing beer, crafting rosaries, and even running small schools for leprous children. They did not live only in waiting for death. They lived, albeit differently. Within these leprosaria, they found new rhythms. One woman might be tasked with keeping the chapel linens clean. Another, like Cecily, might tend to herb garden mint, comfrey, marigold plants thought to soothe both the skin and the soul. Someone else might be the bell ringer for daily prayers, or the keeper of the lectionary. In the quiet of exclusion, they built a quiet society. But the stigma remained powerful beyond the leprosarium walls. Townspeople spoke of them with fear. Children were warned not to stray near the boundaries. Merchants refused coins touched by leprous hands, even though metal could not carry disease. Travelers, upon seeing the white robe or the sounding bell, would cross to the other side of the road. And yet, there were exceptions, moments when fear gave way to human impulse. A daughter slipping food to her father through a gatepost. A wife visiting her husband at dusk, kneeling 6 feet away, speaking through a veil. A baker leaving loaves on a stone ledge, wrapped in linen, with no request for payment. Such moments weren't common, but they happened often enough to survive. In diaries and letters, let's pause for a moment. In one of those moments, a young monk, Brother Thomas, had a sister Agnes who was taken to the leprosarium just outside Worcester in 1284. Every week, after morning prayers, he walked to the edge of the hill that overlooked the enclosure. He wasn't allowed inside, but he stood there and read aloud from the Psalms, hoping she could hear him. He never knew if she could, and still, he returned, week after week. It is details like these that tell you something essential about medieval life, not only about its fears, but about its fidelities. In a world where lepers were marked by bells and buried in unmarked graves, there were still people who spoke their names into the wind. Of course, not all stories end with such grace. By the 14th century, as the Black Death spread and societal pressures mounted, fear of disease reached a fever pitch. Leprosy, once surrounded with ritual compassion, began to carry heavier suspicion. Accusations of sorcery, devil worship, or poisoning wells were leveled not just at Jews or foreigners, but also at lepers. Some leprosaria were attacked in parts of France and Germany. Lepers were tried for imaginary crimes, even tortured for confessions. It's important not to flatten medieval people into villains, though. These acts came from fear, not evil. In the absence of scientific understanding, they created scapegoats. Leprosy, with its mysterious symptoms and long decay, made an easy target. Still, even through this, the Church continued its spiritual care. In many dioceses, bishops issued edicts reminding the faithful that lepers were still souls in need of grace. Alms were encouraged, visitations were allowed at a distance, and on certain feast days, processions would pause outside the leper chapels, offering prayers through the locked gates. The physical separation remained, but spiritually, there was still a thread that connected the living with the exiled. Back in Cicely's leprosarium, the seasons continue. The rosemary bushes bloom in spring. Snow rests lightly on the chapel roof in winter. She wraps her hands in linen, places a sprig of mint in the broth pot, and hums the same melody she once sang to her daughter at bedtime. The memory flickers soft, hazy, but it warms her. A new girl arrives, maybe 13, her face swollen with early lesions. Cicely takes her hand, not with fear, but with familiarity. She shows her how to wrap a bandage, how to listen for the sound of the bell, how to face the world without expecting it to turn back toward you. And that's something worth remembering. Leprosy may have taken faces, fingers, and names, but it could not erase tenderness. The story of leprosy in the Middle Ages rarely ends with a cure. For most who were cast out, people like Cicely, the arc of life narrowed down to something both quieter and deeper. There were no dramatic recoveries, no tearful returns to town squares, no miracle remedies suddenly rediscovered. In the herb garden, life didn't conclude so much as it diminished, slowly, like the wick of a taper burning low in its holder. But that doesn't mean nothing changed. Let's look again at the leprosaria, the small, often overlooked spaces at the fringes of medieval society. For decades, they were treated as sealed-off pockets of sorrow. Yet within those fences, what evolved was more than survival. It was a kind of living memory, a place where wisdom collected in silence. Over time, as fear of leprosy became more manageable and some understanding of the disease's nature developed, many leprosaria shifted roles. Some became almshouses or hostels for the elderly and infirm. Others remained functioning medical enclaves well into the 16th century. And while many residents died within their walls, some lived surprisingly long lives. Cicely, for instance, We imagine her story extending just a few years more might have seen to, or even 3 generations of new rivals. She would have taught the routines, how to tend to wounds, how to signal for help without words, how to sit through pain with composure. Perhaps more importantly, she would have passed on stories, names, traditions, even gossip. These things mattered in places where identities were often stripped away by diagnosis. One such tradition was the Book of Souls simple ledgers kept in chapel corners where residents wrote their names, their parents' names, their birthplaces. For many, it was the only written record that they had existed. Sometimes these books were destroyed or lost, but a few remain in dusty corners of monasteries or locked beneath church vaults. Lists of names written in patient script: Amice, daughter of Tilda the Weaver, Raynaud, born in Angers, Cecily of York, baker's wife. Think of that. Even in exile, they wrote themselves into history. Outside the walls, the world moved on. The structure of society was changing. The Black Death had shifted the balance of labor and land ownership. The rise of universities and new religious orders brought slow changes in medical knowledge. And eventually, as the centuries turned, leprosy itself began to wane in Europe. The reasons are debated. Some credit improved sanitation. Others suggest changes in human immunity or even competition with other diseases like tuberculosis. But by the 1500s, new cases of leprosy had dramatically declined. Leprosaria emptied not in healing, but in disappearance. By the time of the English Reformation, many of these institutions were seized, repurposed, or left to crumble. Stones were stripped from leper chapels to build barns or manor walls. Roofs caved in. Names faded. It was, in a way, a second death, and yet not all was forgotten. The cultural memory of leprosy lingered in art and legend. In paintings and church carvings, you can still find the bowed heads, the bandaged hands, the gentle touch of saints offering bread to the afflicted. Leper bells, once feared, became relics in parish museums. And in literature, the figure of the leper took on complex meanings, sometimes a scapegoat, sometimes a symbol of Christ-like endurance. Even the language survived. To be treated like a leper is still used to describe shunning. It's a heavy phrase, but a revealing one. It reminds us how deeply exclusion was embedded in our cultural consciousness. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is subtler. In the margins of old legal documents, you sometimes find notes in different handwriting, observations from town scribes or clerics. One such note, written in faded ink beside a land grant, reads, "And the woman named Cecily, long absent, who tended the rosemary beds by the chapel, is to be remembered in prayers at Michaelmas." Just a line, barely a memory, but a memory nonetheless. In these scraps of parchment and prayer, we find the persistence of compassion. People who were excluded did not vanish completely. Their kindness, their rituals, even their recipes passed on. A particular way of folding linens, a balm made of yarrow and goose fat, a lullaby hummed to a frightened child. They are threads woven quietly into the tapestry of medieval life. Let's return, one last time, to Cecily. It's late spring. She is older now. Her hands are weaker, her vision blurred, but she still sits outside in the sun. The rosemary bush is in bloom beside her. A boy, a new rival, sits beside her with a swollen ankle wrapped in cloth. He doesn't speak much. She doesn't press him. Instead, she tells him about the moon-shaped bread, how she used to rise before dawn, how the fire had to be just right, how the scent of warm flour made her feel, briefly, like the world was good and safe. The boy listens. He doesn't know how much is true. It doesn't matter. He'll remember the story anyway, because in a place built for forgetting, remembering becomes a kind of rebellion.